The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening. I'm Laura Kaminsky, Associate Director of Education, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Y tonight for the opening evening of our series, Artists' Visions. The format is as follows. Guest artist Chuck Close will present slides of his work, providing a visual context for the conversation which will follow with series moderator Patterson Sims. About an hour or so into the evening, the house lights will come on and you will have the opportunity to ask your questions. Mr. Sims will recognize you and will repeat your question if necessary. It is indeed an honor to welcome Patterson Sims back to the Y. He has participated in our lecture program several years ago, and we're delighted that he is with us again moderating this series. Patterson has served as the Associate Curator of the Permanent Collection at the Whitney Museum of American Art since 1976. A selected listing of his exhibitions includes Representing America, 1900 to 1940, Figure as Subject, The Last Decade, Minimalism to Expressionism, Paintings and Sculpture since 1965, Ellsworth Kelly, Sculpture, Decade of Transition, 1940 to 1950, and Tradition and Modernism in American Art, all at the Whitney Museum, as well as producing many exhibitions in the St. Louis Museum, the Seattle Art Museum, the Spoleto Festival exhibition, and other galleries and museums across the United States. He is the author of many brochures and exhibition catalogs and has lectured at the New School, the Seattle Art Museum, Rutgers University, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Baltimore Museum of Art, the Smithsonian Institution, and many others. Our guest tonight is Chuck Close. His official biography reads something like this. 1940, born. 1962 to 1964, attended Yale University School of Art and Architecture. 1965, first worked from photographs. 1968, began black and white portrait paintings. 1973, birth of daughter, received NEA grant, began dot drawings. 1977, joined Pace Gallery, began pastel works, began fingerprint drawings. 1980, began oil paintings. 1982, began pulp paper collages. 1984, birth of daughter, began Polaroid nude photograph works. That's the official list. And now I'd like to invite Patterson Sims to come out here and add a few more illustrative comments to this list. Thank you.
It's great to talk about and to talk with Chuck because not only of the fluidity of his thought and the cogency of his work, which falls into a piece in such an impressive way, but because the time period in which he's been working is roughly coincident with my own involvement with contemporary art in a professional way. And I remember meeting Chuck first as the person who was accompanying a rather large and woolly dog on his way to the Grand Union supermarket, passing by OK Harris Gallery, where I was working at that time. And Chuck would come very regularly and visit us and monitor our activities with his particular kind of intelligence, making great incisive remarks about what we were doing, which was a fascination to him perhaps because he was often grouped with a group of artists or a number of artists who were represented by that gallery, the so-called super-realists. It was very clear, however, to anybody who looked carefully at his work, that his work was very distinct from the photo representation of their images. He may have used photography for his work, but he actually used the philosophy of photography, and he raised a whole series of issues which were not as fundamental to those artists who also employed this immediate subject. What I think will become very clear to you as you see Chuck's work tonight in slides and hear him talk about it is the tremendous intelligence he brings to the whole issue of what it is to make a representational work and how representation and abstraction are not as far as we've often been told, apart as we might have considered. So I think what I am very conscious of in his work, and what I think you may become conscious of, is what a tremendous sort of leap he has made from working with something that seems so prosaic and basic as the human face, and to rendering it with a kind of intelligence, to repeat that word, and with a kind of insight which catapults the face into not only gigantic scale, but gigantic implication. I'm going to sit up on the stage and occasionally ask Chuck a question, or to maybe try to prod even greater insights into the images that we're looking at, and then we'll join together on those two chairs. But I'm really glad you're all here tonight to hear about Chuck's work.
Thanks for coming. I was one of those lucky people who knew, even at age 4, what he wanted to do. Single-mindedness is a great virtue. You don't spend a lot of time in tangents or chasing wild geese. And I think it always made my life considerably easier to know what it is that I wanted to do. And those of you who are parents, children actually do sometimes grow up to be what they say they wanted to be, which is sort of scary. At any rate, art was the only thing that I ever really felt very good at, the thing which made me feel special, and the thing that seemed to separate me from my friends. And ultimately, I think I maybe became too good at it. One of the real problems is when you have too much ease. There's no resistance. There's nothing to fight against. And I became one of the all-time great students. It was exactly what every faculty member had in mind. I immediately seemed to know what art looked like. And once you know what art looks like, it's not too hard to make some of it. The trouble is, if it looks like art, it's got to look like somebody else's art, or it wouldn't look like art. I had a problem which faced a lot of people who were coming of age in the trying to find out who they were as artists in the 60s, of trying to find a personal voice, an idiosyncratic point of view, some kind of personal vision. And it's important, I think, to remember what a different time it was than the present moment. No value judgments implied, but it was a very different time. We all wanted to separate ourselves from everything else that had ever been made. You were not supposed to bring the baggage of any other art experience to the canvas to experience someone's work. And today, of course, the whole kind of prevailing sensibility is one of appropriation, which is sort of raiding the cultural icebox and looking for things to make art about that are very much about the shared art experience, and making direct references, or perhaps even quoting, or maybe appropriating intact someone else's work. This was inconceivable at the time in which I got out of graduate school. My classmates were people like Richard Serra, Nancy Graves, and Bryce Martin, and Janet Fish, and Raxra Downs, and Newton Harrison, and all kinds of interesting people. And I think that if you look at that group of people, it's clear that we were all driven to extreme personal positions that there are really no common denominators between any of our works. So at any rate, I will start with the point at which I get out of graduate school. And I fell in love with what the idea of being an artist. And I loved the activity of making art. I loved the gushy, wonderful physicality of the paint running between my fingers. And I loved the smell, and I loved, it was the 60s, and if you wanted to smoke grass and do, it was the only, art school was the only place to do it. So I was in love with the idea of being an artist, but I found myself, after having been such a good student and always being able to display what I knew to be what art looked like, and getting the pats on the head and the grades and the scholarships and the Fulbrights and all of that for demonstrating that I knew precisely what art looked like, I found myself sitting alone in the studio without a mature voice, without anything to do, only in love with the activity and not liking the thing that I made. So I spent a couple of rather miserable years trying to teach in the boondocks. The first year that I went there, I was a painter who also taught, and by the second year, I was a teacher who sometimes painted. And I realized that I was in big trouble. I moved to New York. I met my wife when I was teaching there. We moved to New York. And I sat in the studio and I said, I don't know what it is I want to do. And I don't know what a good art idea is anymore. But I know what I don't want to make. And through a series of self-imposed limitations, I just guaranteed that I could no longer make the paintings that I had made before. My paintings were loose, open abstractions that were very tentative. I would paint them in, I would paint them out, they would be on the canvas, they'd be scraped off on the floor. I was flying by the seat of my pants with all my raw nerve endings hanging out. And there were good days and there were bad days. The painting would be great, the painting would be in the toilet. I found that I had almost a kind of, there were times when a painting would be in trouble and I would reach to a favorite old brush that had once pulled off a painting, and this brush was now, it was almost like a divine object. I would pick this up and in some hope that I could, by using it, pull this painting off again. And I found that all of my habits, all of my attitudes, everything that I knew about painting was somehow connected to habits, work habits, and that the only way that I could move, and that doesn't mean growth, it doesn't mean progress, it didn't mean that I was going to make anything any more interesting or more valuable than anything else that I had made, but I could move. I could just move, and that was what was necessary. So I imposed a series of rather strict self-imposed limitations, which just guaranteed that I could no longer make what I had made. And since I tried to make them as different as possible, I wanted to guarantee that the product would be as different as possible from what I had made. So instead of invent an interesting shape, which always was a de Kooning shape or somebody else's shape, I decided to use a photograph so that the shapes that came up were the shapes in the photograph. See, being a good student means that you know that certain shapes are more like art shapes than other shapes. And you also know that certain color combinations look more like art than any others. So I wanted to get color out of the picture altogether. Since I had these strong habits, I would always use the same half a dozen color combinations over and over. So I got color totally out of there, and I decided just to work in black and white. And then I thought, well, I have this trouble. I never know when a painting is finished. I work on it. I leave it alone. I come back to it. I work over it. I scrape it off. I start over. I can't make up my mind. I'm paralyzed. So I decided to work only in black paint on white canvas. And if you put too much black painting on, pretty soon you have an Ad Reinhardt. So I knew that what I had to do was to make every mark count so that I would force myself to make judgments early and live with them. So I decided to just work with black paint on a white canvas in a way that one might, you might understand it by thinking of using a black pencil on white paper. In order to have grays, you put less on. You have to go around the lights, the whites, and not do them. So I started working for photographs. I did away with color. I just used black and white. And then I realized that all my habits with tools were the baggage that I brought with me to make the painting. The history of marks, the history of brush strokes, everything that I'd ever seen about how paint got on a canvas. So I threw all the tools away, and I got a whole set of new tools with which I had no personal history and no particular facility. I had lived by my hand, by my ability to make beautiful art marks. And I wanted to throw away the gesture and the tool that had that gesture somehow associated with it. Now, I had no idea whether what I would make was going to be interesting. And I did a painting, a 22-foot-long reclining nude. And I thought that this would be an interesting subject. And I wanted to make what I thought was the essential American experience, art experience at the time, which came out of a notion of Pollock and others that every piece of the painting was of equal importance. But when I did this 22-foot-long reclining nude, there were a couple of areas of the painting which seemed to be more important than other areas. So judging by the fact that people congregated in certain places. So one day when I was photographing the finished painting, I turned the camera literally on myself as I was the only other person in the room, and took a picture of myself for the first portrait. And with any luck, isn't technology wonderful, really? It's what I wanted to do, this is in my sort of James Dean period, but what I wanted to do was to make a big, aggressive, confrontational painting. To remember in the 60s, stuff was very, abstraction reigned supreme, and things were, I was trained as a junior abstract expressionist, and imagery was not something that was particularly anybody was particularly interested in. But I wanted to make images that mattered to me. Big, aggressive, confrontational images that you had to notice. I've sometimes only somewhat facetiously said that the decision on scale was I wanted to make the biggest painting I could, given the height of my ceiling, because the bigger they are, the longer they take to walk by. Therefore, the harder they were to ignore. And I wanted to try and make paintings about the way the camera sees. I didn't want to have the sitter, in this case I couldn't have done me without a mirror, in the studio with me for the protracted length of time that it takes to make one of these paintings. And that I didn't want to trust my powers of vision, which were that I would be able to remember what the person looked like, and I didn't want it to be the mean average of all of the sittings. If you have a sitter, the sitter over a course of several months gains weight, loses weight, is happy, is sad, their hair grows long, they cut it off, they're sleepy, they're awake. And so I didn't want that kind of mean average of all of their feelings plus my relationship to them. And I thought that the camera would jot down information, freeze it, so I could always refer back and say, gee, did I really see that? And I could return to the source and judge whether or not it was, in fact, what I'd seen. It's probably long enough for you to look at this image. So what I tried to do was to take photographs, but I didn't know how to take them. So I managed to get a lot of depth of field in there. It's a lot of sharp stuff and blurry stuff, which I found to be interesting things to make paintings about, because there was a potential way of reading the painting in which the blurry information took a particular level in space as opposed to the sharp, and there was an independent way to read the painting that wasn't contingent on what we know to be true about the face, that is, that the nose is in front of the cheeks or whatever. These are some of the early black and white paintings. The painting all the way on my left is Joe Zucker, one of my friends, a wonderful painter, who's the only person who anticipated what has been a problem for everyone else. Everybody I've painted has changed the way they looked immediately after I've painted them. And I refer often, when I was making self-portraits, I would often call it him. It's very difficult to deal with an image this high. If your nose has been 1/4 of an inch in real life, it's going to be bent 6 inches in a painting, and you can't ignore it. But Joe, being in a wonderful spirit of collaboration and perversity, who normally has a kind of Harpo Marx sort of fright wig, bought a jar of Vaseline and got a haircut and greased down his hair and borrowed someone else's glasses and a white shirt and tie, which I'm sure he didn't own at the time. And for 1/100th of a second looked like some Midwest used car salesman. But he realized that he needn't be involved, that what I was really involved with was the evidence that someone like that existed. It need not necessarily be him. This is a painting of Keith that I've recycled many times. The reason I have all these slides is to remind you that the history of art should probably be called the history of slides. Or as Joe Zucker calls it, art in the dark. But it did strike me at one point that if some great art world Ayatollah were to wipe out all of the art on the face of the earth, that as long as the slide libraries stayed intact, that art history could go on without skipping a beat. And the reason that I mention this and the reason that I show these slides is that these are not my paintings, and that I think that what I make are objects, and that I take a lot of I put a lot of work and time and thought into making things which have a certain object status, which are to be experienced and are reduced to a certain level of iconography, either in reproduction or in slides. So I hope that some of you have had the experience of standing in front of them, or that you will, and that this will simply remind you of that, or perhaps give you some other entrance into the work at some other time. These paintings are made by both applying paint in an additive way and also removing it. I put very little paint on, about a tablespoon or 2 or 3 tablespoons of black paint on a whole 9-foot high canvas, watered down, applied with often with an airbrush or a sponge or anything else that would get the paint on that didn't have a definitive brush stroke identity, and then remove it where I wanted by either grinding it away or sanding it or using an electric eraser. Now, at a certain point, I guess I had done a number of the black and white paintings, and I wanted to move on, and I didn't have. I thought, well, maybe I should paint something else now. I'd done some heads, maybe I should paint a rock or something. Then it occurred to me that I wasn't very interested in rocks, and that most people don't know anything about rocks, and nobody but a geologist would know or care what kind of job I did. But that we all have logged many hours standing in front of mirrors. Those of us who have beards have logged fewer hours. But the notion that we know and care a great deal about these images appealed to me because these are people who matter to me. These are images that matter a great deal, and I'm going to spend a lot of time trying to, can you focus the one on the right, please? I'm going to try and make something that I think is of value as an object. And a little trouble getting that. We get the dust in focus, but we get the. At any rate, when I had purged the work of color, it was because I had color habits, and I didn't want to go back to falling into those same old color habits. And when I decided the one variable to alter that made the most sense was to keep the image constant and vary some of the other variables, I decided to bring color back into the picture. But when you make a color painting, or when you make a painting in a traditional way with a palette, you're making judgments out of context over here on the palette. And you're hopeful that these judgments that you've made, when you drop them into context in the painting, are the right ones. But I was always very lazy, and I found when I made these judgments out of context and dropped them in, that I would say, oh, well, that wasn't what I had in mind, but it's close enough. Or that isn't what I had in mind, but I like it anyway. And I really wanted to get out of that. In making the black and white paintings, I didn't use a palette. The paint literally mixed on the canvas. So I wanted to find a way to make color paintings in which the paint literally mixed on the canvas. And so I broke down the color image into 3 component colors: red, yellow, and blue, or cyan, magenta, and yellow are the process colors, but we'll just call them red, yellow, and blue. And the drawing on the left was one of the first attempts using colored pencils to build a full color image by superimposing 3 single color images on top of each other: a red one, a blue one, and a yellow one. And the image on the left is one stage of my first color painting, in which one eye has only the magenta or red, and in the one on the left here, the addition of the blue or cyan, and on the right, the yellow making full color, and eventually the full color image. And in a way, I had done something that I had really wanted to do, which is to make every piece of the painting the same, in that every area of the painting is made up of the same 3 colors, stupid colors that you don't care about, that you would never leave in their original form. And it's only how they're mixed together that makes the new color experience. It's the relative percentage, more red than blue, more blue than yellow, which determines the generic color, and the relative density, how much you've applied, that determines how dark it is. And so that the background is the same 3 colors, it's just equal portions of red, yellow, and blue applied very lightly, so it makes a light gray. They cancel each other out and make it gray. And his shirt, for instance, is like 70% blue, 20% yellow, 10% red, but applied much more densely, so it's a dark color. These are the kinds of things that I work from. These are dye transfers. These are the separations which show me what it looks like. The first 2 were red and blue. This is the combination of red and blue together, which show me what the painting should look like at that stage, the second stage. The addition of the yellow and the full color. And here's, starting on the right, painting in progress. And we'll just it's too bad the paintings don't go this fast. If you think that's boring, you ought to make the paintings. And I say that partially facetiously and partially for the shock value, but also to bring up the issue of boredom, because it's such an important issue in art, I think. We have become used to the notion, I think, of children, of artists essentially being children. And as I think it's been perpetuated that the artist is a child at play. And if you're playing and if you're having fun, you must be on the right track. Certainly when I was in art school, that was the way art was taught. Now there are only so many kinds of paintings you can make and have fun doing. What if you don't want to make those paintings? I used to have a great deal of fun in the studio and I didn't like what I made. I now don't have as much fun, but I'm much more engaged in what I make, and I think I'm more professional for doing what's necessary to make something of value. No one asks a writer, about whom we do not have the same notion of we don't think of writers as children, but no one would ask a writer 6 months into a novel, humped over a typewriter with his or her back aching, slamming words together, "Are you having fun?" I mean, no one is going to ask that, because that's not the way we think of a writer creating. One thinks of the nuance, the judgments made of incremental pieces being put together, fashioning a larger thought and a sentence and a paragraph and a chapter. And there's a certain joy in putting those pieces together and making something larger that you care about, that transcends mere, whether or not you're having a good time. So I'm willing to admit what might be on some levels considered boredom or lack of intense emotional involvement, that is like, raw nerve endings. But but I make something which is infinitely more interesting and engaging for me as issues, and hopefully, because this is where it all counts, hopefully they're engaging for the viewer to vicariously experience the incremental involvement that I've displayed for them. And I get to make, you see, one of the things, when I used to make art, with art shapes, I used the same shapes over and over. The minute I accepted the limitations, when things seemed to close down, in fact, they open back up, I find myself making shapes that I never made before. I found myself using color combinations that I never had made before. So I think it's a facetious argument that when one is inventing in what we think is in the normal sense of the word invention, invent an interesting shape and invent an interesting color combination, that somehow someone is ultimately freer. I deny the fact that expression must be. Somebody said about my paintings, it was nice to see paintings that weren't done with a broom. And I just don't think that the only kind of expression, and I happen to be interested in a lot of other kinds of art, and I'm not a narrow person, as I think Patterson will attest, but I don't think that that's the only way that one can make things that are expressive or that have emotional content as well. These paintings are the three, the red, yellow, and blue, stacked up on top of each other, acrylic on canvas about 9 feet high. This is a watercolor about 7 feet high of my wife. I think a rather loving image, although she walks around sticking her lip out and doing impersonations of the painting. It's interesting because the people who have lent me their image, and I think it's an incredibly generous act. If someone lends you, I don't do commission portraits, and I would never want to get involved with people's vanity. So when someone lends me their image, not knowing what I'm going to do with it, and I might recycle it for years. Poor Phil Glass, I've been doing his image for nearly 20 years. it's an incredible act of generosity, but it does take a certain kind of you sort of throw vanity out the window. The thing is that I don't hear those people whine, and the trouble is when you paint someone you live with, you do have another notion about how they feel about how you've painted them. This is on 3 colors of watercolor on paper, I think about 7 feet high. Now, I said that I worked incrementally, and I always did, although you couldn't see it. They're made up of areas, and they're pushed together. And I wanted to make paintings that were of equal importance all over, but how do you feel the same way about background in which you do nothing as you feel about hair or skin or whatever? So I developed a series of drawings that are based on dots, in which literally the mark is inarticulate. It's a dumb, stupid, uninteresting dot, sprayed, that's it. And can you focus the one on the left, please? This is about, I think, about 12 dots across. It's the fewest number of dots that you can build a recognizable image, and it's the size of a postage stamp. The one on the right is 4 times larger. 4 times larger again, and the history of slides. Remember, you take art history courses, can you remember that Rouen Cathedral was the one with the glass crack? Okay. And 4 times again for an image that's about 16 by 20. Now these are blow-ups of the individual things, making all the images the same size, so you see how many dots made each one. And then finally a painting 9 feet high with 106,000 dots. Each dot hit an approximately 10 times, or 1,600,000 dots in 14 months of my life. Thank you very much. In which coveys of dots, clusters of dots, stacked together in a way in which is totally non-symbolic. There's no way to make hair, or no way to make skin, or no way to make glass. You can see that strings of these dots make lines or eyelashes or whatever. And I went all the way from the smallest drawing, where 1 dot is a whole area of the face, to the point where now a dot is a pore or a beard hair or and now, just to quickly show you, I know it's running late, I want to give Patterson a chance to say something, but just to show you how I've recycled images very quickly. The painting that Patterson's probably seen more than he'd like to at the Whitney, the painting of Phil Glass, and a watercolor that's made of square brush strokes. Fingerprint drawing, also the collection of the Whitney on the left, and one on the right that's also round fingerprints, but just more of them. So you get different thresholds of information. A thing which is sort of like herringbone thing, dot, dash things, and a random more recent random fingerprint drawing on the right. A drawing in which diagonal lines are used. Little lines to make values, and a recent pulp paper piece in which I made a painting by applying wet pulp paper directly to a canvas. These images from 68 through 86 still dealing with the same photograph, because the photograph in a way is like a well to which I can return and draw a different bucketful of stuff out than I got the last time. And I've always been interested in the sort of high school lab experience of seeing how much the choices of what to do in the studio change the experience. And by keeping something constant, by using the same photograph over and over, I'm more aware of how the other differences have changed. A watercolor of myself that's a black white watercolor, about just black watercolor on white paper, about 6 or 7 feet high, and an etching that's made with diagonal lines, a random fingerprint drawing, and a pastel on the other side with dots. A scribble drawing in which I simply scribble in each area, and a more recent pulp paper image. An acrylic painting and a pastel. See, when I used the acrylic paintings, I used only these 3 colors. So I wanted to change. When I get bored, I don't get bored with the images I make. I get bored with what I'm doing in the studio each day. So I went to a medium in which I had the exact opposite experience. Pastels are the medium in which the greatest number of stock standard colors exist. If you buy all the brands, literally there are thousands of pastels. So instead of using 3 colors over and over, I now spend all my time going through drawers trying to find the closest appropriate pastel, which part of my perversity is to make it somewhat difficult for myself, a certain amount of resistance, a certain amount of difficulty. Back yourself into a corner in which you can't turn to someone else for an answer, and problem creation versus problem solving. Everybody knows what the art world problems of the moment are, and then you can make some of it, you can solve it. But I've always been interested in trying to back yourself into your own personal corner in which nobody else operates, so that you can't turn to someone else for answers. This is me working on a recent, boy, I've gotten bald. There's no getting around it. Gee, we get rid of that slide. An oil painting, which is, an oil painting which is very quickly based on golf. Golf is the only sport in which you move from general to specific. The first stroke you just hit, you don't even know where the hell the pin is. Second stroke you're correcting, you're hoping to get close to the green. The third stroke you should be on the green. The fourth stroke you should be in the hole, a very specific place. So I made an oil painting in which I tried to have each square of the painting a par 4 square. But just to make things interesting, and because I'm a reasonably perverse person, I tee off in the opposite direction. If I know that it's going to be an orange, the first stroke will be a blue, so that the second stroke that goes on top will have to correct like crazy, because it's really got to make up for the first thing. And then the second, then a correcting stroke that drops on top of that. Say it's an orange now, it's the right generic color, but it needs to be a yellow or orange. Then I'll put a stroke of yellow on top of that. And now it's the right color, but it's too bright. So right in the middle of that, I'll put a little dot of green or purple or blue or something to optically mix with the color and drop the intensity and make it a duller orange. And if I do right, I get in par 4. But you can also have a birdie, sometimes even an eagle, and of course the dreaded bogey and double bogey, and you can in fact get mired down in a sort of aesthetic sand trap where you just keep making strokes on top of each other to no apparent good whatsoever. But it's not that I think that it's at all a frivolous activity, but that I think the way you choose to do something influences the way it looks and therefore what it means. And any permutations or any route that I can take myself through as an artist will leave residue as a vicarious experience for the viewer, and I hope makes for a different kind of experience than just another head. Recently, I've been doing pulp paper pieces. These are collages. You can see me on the right. I use 24 tones from white to black, pulp paper chips, and also a warm set, a cool set, a neutral set, and they're glued on top of each other to make these collages. A collage on the left of my daughter, and one on the right is a more recent work that's done with wet pulp. The same pulp that I use in dried chip form here, applied like you're making a pizza on the painting on the floor, on the one on the right. A random fingerprint drawing on the left and a collage on the right. For a number of years, I've been involved with making incremental marks with my fingers, which are very personal marks, clearly, and they are portraits of me as well as the person I'm making. This is an unfinished, this is a purposefully unfinished, left unfinished drawing, which shows what the paintings look like before they're complete, which I always thought was self-indulgent to leave a painting unfinished. So I would make drawings about it. A small painting on canvas, 3-color finger painting. A recent 3-color finger painting of my wife, and a pastel on my left, on your right, that is done on top of a very rough formed piece of pulp paper. Recent view from the last show, and a black and white finger painting, just black fingerprints on a white canvas of my wife's grandmother, a wonderful old lady, terrific person, the only survivor of her family, her entire family, I think her 9 brothers and sisters, and her mother and father and all her aunts and uncles were killed by Hitler, and she's the only survivor. Incredible person. And I think her face is a roadmap of a lot of her experiences. I think often is the case. I don't have to crank up for a lot of so-called humanist portraits and things. I have thought that you can only talk about issues of humanity and things like this by making bloated, dead, blind figures, and that you have to crank it up to and make it about these extremes in order to comment on humanness. And I think clearly there is a tremendous amount of information in a neutrally presented image without any reason to amplify it or crank it up for extra added impact. A finger painting, 3-color finger painting of my daughter, my older daughter, and a small fingerprint drawing of her. And also I've been making photographs. We're hanging there, Patterson, I'm almost done. Recently, I used to make photographs to make paintings from, and they weren't objects in themselves, and I wasn't a photographer. And then I got involved with Polaroid, and I, for the first time in my life, made photographs that I wasn't going to use to make paintings from. And this is the 4080 camera, a very large camera in Boston, which is actually a room. Camera means room. And the lens, this is on the outside of the camera. You can see me with my head in a neck brace, and the lens, and you can see the strobe lights. You can see how I'm being positioned in front of the lens. You then can walk inside the camera. The room is 12 by 12 by 18, something like that. The image is thrown across the room on the far wall, and you focus. It's a fixed focus flat plate lens, so the subject is moved in and out to focus, to left to right, up and down on a forklift truck. And here we are inside, the one on the left is inside the camera. We're peeling. You remember the old Polaroids where you peeled them? Here we are peeling a 4080 section on the floor and assembling it on the right. We're assembling one of these composite self-portraits. Here we are putting it up, and that's what the image looks like up. These are 2024 photographs and 4080 photographs and composites that were made with Polaroid. And then most recently, I returned to the nude. Remember her? Remember? But I decided I've always just painted my friends, but all my friends are now as old as I am. And I was afraid we'd all look like Boteros. So rather than embarrass anybody with cellulite and stretch marks and things, I hired, for the first time, I hired nice, young, hard, athletic, dancer-type bodies, and I made a series of photographs. These are the height. There's a male and female version that goes. Did I get a head one here? Yeah. that go opposite each other in a narrow corridor, so that you have to press up against one to see the other, and to make a very uncomfortable kind of sort of sandwich. And I wanted to, here I am photographing. The funny thing about these is that it was very cold. And when I did the reclining nudes, the only part that was uncovered was the part we were photographing. So it made it much more, there were like sweaters and things on, and then there'd be like one section that would be naked, and then there'd be socks. But here I am on the outside of the camera shooting one of the models for a torso. You can see the size of these. These are the most recent photographs that I've been making. And ta-da! Okay.
Do you want to step off stage for me? Let's set up for you.
Are you going to accompany me?
Chuck makes one feel blissfully redundant because he's so wonderfully articulate. As I looked at the big heads, I thought of a remark by Georgia O'Keeffe's that when she started making the magnified flower paintings, that she said she made them that big because she wanted to make even busy New Yorkers see a flower as she did. Well, a lot of busy New Yorkers in this room have seen the face as Chuck sees the face. The face that you work with, Chuck, is essentially a white male or female Caucasian adult face. Have you ever thought of broadening the range?
Well, I have photographed black people. Friends of mine, but I've never gotten a photograph that I really wanted to work from. One of the things that happens is that I photograph relatively indiscriminately all of my friends. And many people that I really would like to paint, I've never gotten a photograph that I really want to work from. And someone else that I may have been much less interested in painting theoretically, or in just thinking about it casually, ended up to be a much more interesting photograph to work from. So, but you know, the thing is that a series for me might take, if a painting takes a year, you know, a series could take 10 years, what any other normal artist would do in a few months. And I also have recycled a lot of images, so I haven't done as many people as I want, but theoretically there are as many paintings as there are people. And I don't think of my career, as if I were to compare my career with other people, I would be very upset. I seem to be like running in slow motion. And like I say, a series can take a decade interspersed with other things. So I expect to be doing other images, but I just haven't gotten around to them.
Some of the early subjects that you worked with that we saw on the first slides were your friends and colleagues in graduate school, artists like Richard Serra and Nancy Graves, the composer Philip Glass, Bob Israel, who've gone on to be considerably famous people. Of course, you painted them at a moment when you didn't necessarily expect that would happen.
Yeah, they didn't expect it either. But I wanted an anonymous image. I wanted somebody who was, I didn't want to make famous folks like Warhol made, or I didn't want to do, university presidents. If I didn't care about the people, I couldn't put the time and energy into it. I have no feeling about time. I would rather have a 30-second line drawing by Matisse than a 2-year pot boiler by Bouguereau or something. Although I like Bouguereau, but I was by some I don't. To me, there's no connection with time in terms of the value of the work. I don't think my work is valuable or important because I put a lot of time into it. Essentially, if you've got a 30-second idea, and there are a lot of wonderful 30-second ideas, and you spend 45 seconds doing it, you've probably overworked it. There's got to be something about the speed at which you're working which is appropriate to what it is you're trying to do. If you were to try and trace very slowly a gesture that's made quickly, you realize the difference between the one has a sense of urgency, it just happened, that's the way it is, and the other seems forced and labored. Now, if you have, on the other hand, on the other extreme, a 14-month idea, and you're only willing to spend 12 months doing it, then you didn't put in what was necessary to do that. So I think there are things that have to do with the kind of project, the kind of thing you want to make, and a certain amount of time and energy that goes into it, without the value judgment of time spent, that it's more important because more time was spent. Certain things are not. So I like the poem. I like the idea of a drawing being the photograph, meaning being a frozen second in time. It cuts across time. It's a frozen moment. It's like a poem. But my working time is novelistic. It's like the time that people spend to write a book. I try and make these paintings that I work on for a long period of time look like they just happened. That there's almost like magic.
As we were looking at the image of your wife Leslie's grandmother, you discussed it in terms that one might describe generally as humanistic. However, that's not the way you discuss most of your images.
Well, I'm not the guy with the cigarette. I'm not the James Dean. You have to remember what the 60s were like, and it was a pretty tough time to bring up an image, and you better have a very aggressive and confrontational pose. Certainly the artists that I painted, then you think of Richard Serra and some of the people, the image that they wanted to present as well, and the way they wanted to look in my paintings was very, tough and streetwise and whatever. And over the years, just of working with images that matter so much to me, my friends and relatives, and most recently, almost all women. I think since the birth of my children, especially my last child, everybody I seem to do seems to be a mother or a grandmother or something. I think I've mellowed and changed a lot in my attitude towards the image and how I want to, why I want to make it. And why you want to make something changes how it looks and what it means.
So much of the thrust of your work that comes across in a very succinct presentation such as you gave tonight is an indication that formalism, the actual act of working and working through a variety of methodologies as you create your images, is central to your endeavor. So it's wonderful to hear this kind of lyric tenderness.
Well, I mean, it's all, I think one of the problems is that I think rhetoric lags behind art. And I came up in a formalist time, so the only way I know how to talk about art is in formalist terms. But and if I keep talking about how things are made or the process, I'm not interested in the process if it doesn't make something that I'm a real process artist, was much more interested in the process than there was sort of the detritus, the evidence that some activity had taken place, but it was the activity that counted. I've always cared about the object status of the art itself, and I only want to make quality art objects, things that have meaning to me and to other, and hopefully to other people. So there's the formalist underpinnings. I came up at the same time as all those other people, and the same things that influenced them influenced me. But I think that I hopefully I have backed myself into my own personal idiosyncratic corner, where it's not appropriate to ask de Kooning how he would solve my problem, or anyone else. And so it's the formalist underpinnings in a way have been very liberating, because they've allowed me to be me, and I think it's almost like a barometric reading of who I am. In a sense, the evidence is all right out there. You can read it. I think, at least I hope.
As again we were looking at the portrait of Leslie's grandmother, and you spoke about it in a very tender way, would you expect the people looking at that work would have some of the same kind of response?
Well, she didn't. She ate that painting. I was hoping that she didn't wear her glasses on the day that she came to the gallery, but she did not like that painting. All she could see was a woman who'd gotten very old and very wrinkled, and wasn't the young woman that in 1910 had come from Europe, or 14 or whatever it was. But I think it's a tender, she would find it abrasive and, and ugly and whatever, but I think it's a tender image. And it also corresponded roughly to my mother dying. And I think I never had made a painting of my mother. And so I think it was an attempt to make all mothers, or well, certainly the other mothers in my life, my wife's mother and grandmother.
When one looks at your work, again, in this kind of presentation, it becomes clear that it went from a very formalist, rather rigid, black and white reality to something that now is much closer to expressionism.
See, I think that the paintings always were more expressive and expressionist than, here's something that's hard to understand. Believe me, everybody who knows me cannot figure out how the hell I make the paintings I make. I am a slob. I'm lazy, and I'm a nervous wreck. So if I lived in California, I'd say, hey, that's the way I am, go with the flow. And I'd make quick, sloppy, nervous paintings. But because I live in New York, which is, as everyone knows, a much more perverse place to live, I said, why should I be held captive by my nature? Just because that's who I am, why are those the only kind of paintings that I can make? And so I think what I've done is deal with who I am and deal with my nature by not allowing me to make the thing which is the path of least resistance, the easiest thing that I would do. So I made paintings that look very neat. And they're made in absolute squalor. And I'm splattering and kicking the painting, and there's a mess, and there's coffee spilled everywhere. And I'm actually moving my hand in the same old abstract expressionist way that I always did. It's just that it ends up looking neat and controlled, and those early paintings were they're very physical. Those paintings were manipulated like crazy. But the paint is so thin, so you have to have layer on layer on layer of thick paint stacked up on top of each other to see the evidence of physicality. But if the paint is so thin, you're laying it on top of each other, you don't see the successive layers. You don't know how the artist's hand moved. My hand was moving in a very different way than anybody ever guesses by looking at those paintings. And to me, they're far more like my early expressionist works than anybody ever has understood from looking at the final results of them.
Now, sort of in striking contrast to this sense of heroic free will, you and I had talked recently about how your art is actually a wonderful manifestation of your dyslexia. Could you talk about your difficulties in that area and how they really relate to the art you make?
Well, it relates in all. I wouldn't be an artist if I weren't, unable to do virtually everything else. Art saved my life. When I was a kid, and there was all this evidence that I was, an awful student, couldn't learn, and whatever. Art was the one area in which I had facility. And pretty soon I realized that it could pull my ass out of the fire. That if I had a teacher, I couldn't remember the names and dates of battles or expeditions or whatever. So instead of remembering when the Lewis and Clark expedition took place, I would do a 20-foot long mural of Lewis and Clark Trail. And that would show the teacher that even though I couldn't give the information back or show interest in the course in the traditional way, that I wasn't a malingerer, that I wasn't a goof off, that I did in fact. And most teachers along the way would accept alternate activity as evidence of concern. One of the things that I've discovered most recently is that one of the characteristics of the particular learning disability thing, whatever the hell it is that I have, is a real problem with facial recognition. And that everybody that I meet, even casually, looks instantly familiar to me. And somebody that I maybe went to college with and lived with, I don't even, they just look like somebody that I met in a supermarket. So I think I don't think there's any accident that I was driven to the making of portraits as a very important manifestation of particularly who I am and what makes me different from other people, and a real attempt to zero in and understand just what these people look like. Because I have, so I never know anybody's names. I know the name of about 6 people on the face of the earth, and so I can't, and I'm not sure when I see their face whether I know them either. So it's it's just awful, and I get by saying hello to everybody. Although I'm sure that people think I'm very rude, and it's a real problem. But I don't think anything's an accident. I don't think it's an accident that I gravitated towards work with a very specific thing to do every day, because that one of the problems with dyslexia or learning disability is that you're thrown for a loop every minute. You say, oh, what's the system for this? How do I understand how to deal with this? My wife, after 20 years of marriage, pointed out to me that, for instance, she said, I've watched you walk the dog for 20 years. Every day you have to look for the leash. Says, haven't you ever noticed that other people hang the leash in the same place? I thought, oh my God. I mean, it was like it had never occurred to me. It was the most amazing well, of course, but I had to think, where did I have the leash last, Every single time. Well, I think that I found a way to work with a very specific thing to do. And I'm going to do today what I did yesterday, and I'm going to do tomorrow what I did today, and there's going to be a continuum, and I'm going to know what the rules are. I've already done this, so if I've done this, I'm going to be able to do that. And it makes every experience positive and productive. And there are all kinds of wonderful, I'll use writers as an analogy, because this working incrementally is an analogous situation. But also, I think of like brick architecture, building a building. There's nothing about the increment that says anything about the brick, that says anything about the building that you're going to build. You stack the bricks up one way, you make a cathedral. You stack them up another way, you make a slaughterhouse. There's nothing about the brick that says anything about what you're going to do about it. And the joy for me in making art is having a vocabulary and then running with it and understanding the language and putting the pieces together and knowing it intimately. And I think that's a real manifestation of the particular problems that I had and turning them around and making them work for me rather than being a detriment.
Your talk of your difficulties involved in walking your dog brings me back to what I said at the beginning of my remarks, the notion that I've seen your work evolve over about 16 or 17 years, and these are years in which your life has changed. You've become a very successful artist from an artist who was, relatively speaking, unknown. I'd like to kind of move a series of a few questions into a more general realm and ask you a little bit about what it's like 17 years later in terms of being an artist who lives in New York, who's based yourself in New York, and who came here as an artist who wasn't well known, was doing something utterly contrary to what was going on, and is now an artist who's considered a semi-senior figure.
Does that mean middle-aged? Does that mean? Well, when I came to New York, it's New York can seem like a very unhealthy place to be. It happens to be where I got healthy, so it seems like a good place to be, a healthy place to be. But I think it was a much easier time to be an artist. When I came to New York in the 60s, you could survive. Well, I survived on $3,000 a year. And we didn't live too well, but it was possible to have, I had 2,500 square feet to work in. I was able to teach a couple days a week. There were still teaching jobs then. And work part-time and and make art the rest of the time. And the whole notion of what you were as a success was if you interested a few colleagues, there were a few other artists who were interested in what you're doing, perhaps a dealer, maybe a collector, and you could survive, as I thought I always would have to survive, with a profession to support my profession, indefinitely, and feel like a success. And I think the incredibly difficult situation today with rents $2,000 or $3,000 a month for a loft, and artists doubling, tripling up with roommates, painting during the day, painting at night, full-time jobs, and where the whole notion of what is success has become, houses, architect-designed homes in Architectural Digest and parties in Vanity Fair. That notion of success is a very different art world, and I think it's had a very profound influence on the kinds of choices that young artists have made. I don't think there's any question but what the appeal of appropriation today is largely due to the fact that people don't have time to develop a personal and idiosyncratic point of view. They're investing a few years and it's costing them a fortune, and they're here, and well, I've got to make it all happen right now. So you appropriate a mature art style from, sort of like, I call it the Chinese restaurant school of painting. You sort of take one from column A, one from column B, and put it together in a way that is a little different from the way we've seen it before, but whatever. But I think that the appeal is definitely because of the pressure, the incredible need to, and the careerism that has taken place, which I like a great deal of what's going on, but I think it's a very difficult time to be a young artist.
You're affiliated with quite a glamorous gallery, and your shows seem to do quite well when they happen. How does that affect your making of the art, knowing that there seems to be an almost built-in audience?
Well, it's like dying and going to heaven as far as I'm concerned. I do what I do, and I get paid to do it, which I never thought would happen. Okay? So, but it's a problem. I think about what I do, I make money from. I've tried never to make things to court a particular market, or, and in fact, if I had listened to practical people, I wouldn't be where I am today. People say, what are you going to do, sell paintings of somebody else's head? Who wants somebody else, a 9 foot high on top of it? It won't even go over the couch. You better make smaller ones, and you better make them a little colorful, and they better be and do commission portraits or make them a famous. Well, if I listened to anybody anywhere along the line, I would have been in big trouble. So I think but artists are always going to figure out a way to give you what you thought you wanted in a way which you never expected, and you'll learn to love it.
Just one more question before I turn it over to the audience. What would you change about the sort of art world or art community that surrounds us right now if you had the power to?
Well, I guess I wouldn't change anything in a sense. I mean, I sometimes say, if I were the Ayatollah, I would not allow this, because I'm capable of being narrow on occasion as well. But one of the things that makes the New York art world, that is the American art world, and basically the New York art world is the American art world for most purposes. What makes it so dynamic and exciting is its voraciousness, is the fact that it gobbles up art and just has a never-ending need for for more stuff. And it happens to be hard on artists because it tends to want to force you to collapse your career into a short time which corresponds to your place in the sun, and you're not supposed to have legs, and a career that lasts more than a decade is almost considered to be in bad taste. Go to retirement home and let someone else have your position in the gallery. But I think that's in Europe. People have respect for the artist. You can wait your whole lives before you make. But it isn't as interesting somehow as our system, which is, just devours incredible amounts of art. I guess the one thing that I do regret is the abdication by critics, curators, and dealers of a certain kind of position that once was taken about making judgments about work to the collectors / what do you call those people? The people who show other people what to collect.
Advisor.
Yeah, advisor. Collector / advisor. That the critic used to worry about if he or she wrote about someone, that stuff was going to be around in print. So you didn't want to. There was some commitment to the work and to the ideas, and a laying of one's neck on the line for things which were considered important. Clearly, museum curators did the same thing. You assemble a body of work, and you say a bunch of people together, and you say this is a tendency worth looking at, and draw circles around it and point arrows at things. And then if a few years later nobody thinks this is a very interesting tendency or some other thing, then that curator's rear is hanging out in the breeze. And clearly gallery people also made, and when they were commit themselves to an artist, it was for the long haul, for changes in his or her vision and development. The thing that I think is sort of unfortunate right now is that the people who are sort of like leading forays through the Lower East Side, it's like sharks. They have to keep swimming, they have to keep moving, or they die. They have to keep finding more stuff without the level of commitment to the artist. And I I think in some ways the artist is victim of this, you are what I need at this particular moment because I need to find more new stuff. And it doesn't have anything to do with where that artist is in his or her career and whether it should be out, whether it would be better if they spent a little bit more time, were a little more selective, thought about going public with it. And I sort of regret that. I think that's an unfortunate tendency at the moment.
Now, there's some thoughts from people out there. Yes.
I just had to ask you about how you address the canvas or the paper. The grid has to always be there in your method of it.
Sometimes it is, and sometimes I remove it. I'll turn my back while those of you've all... As far as I'm concerned, you've all done more than you have to. So any of you, we're now into the beyond the Call of Duty phase, where I promise not to take. I won't remember your names.
It's important, though, you remember the question. How does Chuck? She asked. How does Chuck address the canvas?
There's an increment that you work from, and on some of them, it was just in the upper part of the canvas, and there had to have been a grid. You can't just start anywhere,
Yeah.
but then you might find one ear off the thing.
Right. Well, the grid was a mapping device, just like it's convenient to be able. If you had the United States without all the little states, you'd say, "Where is Detroit?" Well, it's up there where those lakes are. Absolutely. So that was the mapping device that was necessary for making the early, and all the continuous tone paintings actually have crosshairs, or so I used to snap a grid on with a chalk line, so that I could dust the chalk off and remove it as I would go, because I didn't want the grid to show, and I wanted it to be a seamless, continuous tone image. Then when by the time I got involved with the dot pieces, I drew the grid on, left it there, and the increment stayed clear for everyone to see. And I have vacillated back and forth, or I have simultaneously continued to make both continuous tone products and things that are incremental where the increments show. And I always enjoy flipping back and forth between them because I find them to be very different notions of how to build an image.
The portrait of Phil Glass that the Whitney Museum owns, it's on the 3rd floor of the museum, and it's an opportunity to see in the permanent collection that work. Any of you who haven't seen one of Chuck's works in front of you as opposed to a slide. The grid is now showing through on that work. I was going to wait to this moment to see Chuck's reaction, but in fact you can see the grid coming through.
Where?
Well, we'll go and look at it tomorrow together. Other thoughts or questions? Yes, sir.
Despite Chuck's reference to the neutrality he was trying to achieve, he referred to staying away from sensationalism in the selection of his subject matter. I wonder, you spoke about taking many photographs, and some would not appeal to you, and some would, and they weren't necessarily friends or people you knew.
Well, they were all friends, but it was the degree of it, yeah.
Can you elaborate on what it is that made you decide on a particular one?
Yeah.
He was asked what attracts Chuck to particular images amongst the numerous photographs that he takes.
When I photograph people, I guess, well, the first part of what you said about the neutrality, it's not neutral in the sense of no feeling, no commitment and no interest. It's that I have wanted to take a flat-footed approach, a kind of, sort of, it's what it is. But the images matter a great deal to me, and the people my photograph matter a great deal to me, and of course some of them matter more to me than others. When I shoot without knowing what's going to come up either on the proof sheet or in the transparencies. And then what I do is I take a loop, a photographer's loop, a magnifying lens, and I scan the photograph, and I imagine what it would be like to make a painting from that photograph. And I'm somebody who's plagued by decision making. I can't decide what to have in a restaurant, you know. I'm always, trying to decide whether I should have this. And then the minute I order it, it was wrong. And what you got is far more interesting than what I'd like to. So, but the funny thing is that I've never had any trouble picking a photograph to make a painting from. The minute I scan them, one of them is always infinitely more interesting to source for a painting than any of the others. And it's never been a problem at all, surprisingly enough, for me to make that decision. And it has less to do with how much I wanted to do that painting than that image than what I think it would be like to make the painting from. Because it's paintings I make. I care about paintings, and the process is important in that it determines the nature of that painting. But if they don't make sense as paintings, if they don't hang on the wall with other paintings and hold their own, then I failed. And no one really cares how involved I am with a person if I don't make a good painting.
Let's take a couple of more questions, and then Chuck will, I'm sure, be happy to help you a little later. Yes. In the back.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed the talk. I wanted to ask you if there were any abstract artists that come to mind that were very helpful to you.
Yes, actually, that's a good question. I'm glad you asked that, because
She wanted to know if any abstract artists particularly appealed to Chuck and were helpful for him in developing his work.
we have been taught, again, by art historians, and I know that Patterson won't have any trouble with this at all, but that sort of the Old Testament version of art history. So-and-so begat so-and-so who begat so-and-so who begat so-and-so. And it's a linear, straight line. This was influenced by that and whatever. And it's a very simplistic, stupid view of art history. Anybody who's had anything to do with the art world knows that that's not how it happens, no matter what evidence there is to the contrary. And that the mix of ideas that's in the air at the time in which you come up is like the what do you call it when you're gonna have a petri dish full of something and you have to have the right environment in which to grow a certain thing, whatever. You have to have the right conditions for certain ideas. Don't come at the wrong time. They come when everything was right for them to happen. And there's a lot of luck in art as well, and being at the right place at the right time, and being open to certain things, being sensitized to certain things, feeling certain things in the air, and then obviously hard work and desire and whatever. But one might think that if someone works representationally, that the things that made the most sense or were the most important experiences or influences were other representational things. And that in my case is not the case at all. Almost all of my early painting experiences were abstract. Almost all of my gods and heroes and heroines worked abstractly. A lot of my friends today don't make anything that remotely resembles what I do. I've never been interested in surrounding myself with a group of people who work similarly, and we all sort of march lockstep together towards something or support each other. And the thing that happens is that the people who influence you the most are the people, strangely enough, that you talk to, not the people you look at. Other artists, trying to figure out why they're working today. They change your mind, change your attitudes, give you much more of a sense of what's possible by what they've chosen to do or to ignore. And so the most important artists for me are the people who came up with me, who talked to me, who read my paintings and I read theirs, or I would help them build their sculpture, and they would. Often the people who are most helpful to a painter are people who aren't painters, sculptors who don't have any investment in. They're not. If they talk to you about your painting, they're not. They can get right into your issues because they're not a painter. So I think that's part of the mix of the art world that's very important, is having a lot of people around you who are trying to figure out why they want to make art right now and what makes this a particular time in which to make art that's different from all other times, and what the sense of urgency of the moment really is.
One more question, yes.
In reference to your pulp portraits, you said something about using dry and wet.
Yeah.
Understand how the wet it is, but what do you do with the dry, and are you free in doing that? Because that's what comes to the
Yeah. Let me just explain what pulp is. Some of you may not know. Pulp is really beaten up rags that are used in the making of paper. And you can buy this stuff and you beat it up in a beater, and then you can add pigment to it. And in this case, we added black pigments, warm blacks and cool blacks, and we made this range of grays. And initially, I was making multiples. And what I was doing was stuffing some of each pulp color into the space of a grill. And that grill was embedded in a kind of carrier sheet of wet pulp that would become the background. And then after we put all pulp into all these spaces, we take the grill off and then shove it around or let it dry or press it or do whatever. And in the process of making these prints, they're not really prints, but because a print is made in a different way. Each one of these is made from scratch all over each time. But in the process, pulp would fall on the floor. And they would harden into these little chips. They look like any of you who were farmers, they look like little miniature meadow muffins. See? And they were different colored grays. And I liked them. They were nice looking little things, very organic looking. And they came in all these different grays. So I started picking them up and collecting them. And then the collages grew out of like overlapping them and trying to build an image out of them. And then ultimately I went back to using raw pulp, wet pulp, directly on the canvas for some others. In that case, all the work has to be done before you make the painting. Weeks of preparatory drawings and figuring out where it's going to go and making all the decisions, because the painting is done on the floor, on a scaffolding. You roll over the thing. I'm lying on my stomach and I'm calling out the numbers of the grays I want, and they throw me a handful of the stuff and I put it on. And it all has to be done in one day from start to finish, one long day. But it's nice to have a totally different experience from the other things.
I want to thank you, Chuck, for being so helpful.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you all for coming tonight. I look forward to seeing some of you in coming weeks, but I really want to thank Chuck very much for being so informative.
Thank you, Patterson.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.